We now have a more accurate understanding, historically speaking, of what westward movement was all about. We realized the fact that this was a commercial venture. This was geographical expansion of capitalism, industrial capitalism to be specific, moving from east to west. And we also recognize the fact that the industries on the western tip of this movement were a bit different from the east. In fact, quite different from the east or the Midwest for that matter. But they're still industries nonetheless. This is still industrial capitalism. So the cattle industry comprised of cowboys working as laborers, right? The mining industry, the agribusiness industry, these are still industries. And like any other industry at this time, the industrialist sought the cheapest labor possible. Let's remember that we are labor poor at this time, and therefore the pursuit of cheap labor entailed looking abroad. And by the way, this still applies today. You look abroad for the cheapest labor because it's cheaper for that industrialist to pay a foreign worker compared to an American worker. All right, now we also realize this, that are those industrialists in the West, are they going to seek the cheapest labor by going all the way to the east? No, they're not. They're already practically at the shores of the Pacific, right? So therefore they're going to cast their gaze westward, that is the Pacific. They're going to look at countries to the west as well as our neighbors to the south, I have to say. But when it came to the Chinese working on the railroad industry and the mining industry and agribusiness, well, much of that labor will be sought across the Pacific, specifically the China, and then later, and we'll discuss this, the Japanese and even Filipinos once they become our colonial subjects. Again, that's a topic for the future. Now, before we begin to discuss the specific reason as applies to Chinese immigration during the 19th century, first of all, we have to take a step back and analyze immigration in a general sense. And this is one perspective out of several by which you could analyze human migration. Okay, and that involves push factors versus pull factors. And even without looking at the slide here, if you imagine the terms push factors and pull factors, you probably have an idea of what those terms refer to. But again, looking at the slide, right, here's the definition. Push factors are those factors shaping the migratory movements of people that are located in their place of origin, in the immigrant's home country, so to speak. Okay, now this could involve a host of factors or reasons. For example, certainly economics, right? If they're experiencing economic hardship, economic destitution, that's one factor. Political turmoil in the home country, war, religious persecution in their home country, or a combination of those factors, right? So these, again, are factors that you could almost literally imagine as pushing them out of the country, right? So some examples, well, think about the war in Ukraine when Russia invaded several years ago. Well, you see this massive movement of migration of Ukrainians out of the country, out of their country, and certainly war was the primary push factor in that regard. Or think U.S. history, we're familiar with the Puritans or the Pilgrims, so to speak. They were pushed out of England due to a religious persecution. Okay, so that obviously involves religion. Now, moving to the pull factors, those are the factors shaping migration that are located in the immigrant's place of new settlement, okay? the host country, so to speak. And here is where you could analyze specific immigration. They're going to a specific destination as their choice, and you analyze why they're at that particular location, right? And again, you can almost think of this literally, what's pulling them to that particular place? What made them decide in their decision making, obviously, to migrate to that particular place? Okay, and that's a pull factor. Okay, now when you take these all together, they serve as a pretty good constellation of factors by which to analyze immigration, whether, again, contemporary immigration, certainly Chinese immigration, and other forms of human migration. As noted there, it's important to consider both in the analysis of immigration. Like, there are immigrant issues often in contemporary society, right? In our country, well, you should analyze both push factors and pull factors. Take into account both to have a more nuanced understanding of what immigration is all about. Now, this is not the only way to analyze human migration, push versus pull. In fact, we're going to introduce, if you will, the more macro perspective, historically speaking, like how imperialism or globalization influences immigration, and we'll get to that in the future. But you could certainly think about push and pull factors in conjunction with those macro perspectives. Again, this is a topic for a future lecture. Okay, so now that we're fully aware of what push factors and pull factors refer to, we could begin to analyze the specific case of Chinese immigration to the U.S. West by the mid-1800s. So, let's first look at some push factors that explain Chinese migration during this time. The first thing we have to recognize is the fact that during the 19th century, during the 1800s, China as a whole was experiencing political turmoil. Now, what is behind this? Well, if you know anything about Chinese history, you probably heard these terms nonetheless. What you had as a sort of institution that ruled over China during this feudal period, pre-modern period, were dynasties, right? You may have heard the Ming Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. Well, it's exactly the Qing Dynasty that was reigning China at this time during the 19th century. But by this time, after centuries of rule, by this time it's beginning to collapse. It's experiencing dynastic decline. All right. Now, again, looking at the history of feudal China, the dynastic periods, each dynasty in their history went through a period of, initial formation, and then centuries of rule, and then they decline, and they collapse, only to be replaced by a new dynasty. Okay, so this is exactly what's happening with the Qing Dynasty. Okay, now let me give you a little background on the Qing Dynasty. The Qing and the Qing Emperor, they're actually not ethnic Chinese. Okay, ethnic Chinese, by the way, they refer to themselves as Han, the Han Chinese, H-A-N. Okay, now the Qing, on the other hand, were not Han Chinese. They're actually foreigners, and they originated from the northern regions of East Asia, places that we're familiar with, like it's basically around or nearby Mongolia and the northern regions. But they went southward and conquered China, okay, and took over and established their dynasty, and referred to as the Qing Dynasty. Again, spelled Qing, the Qing dynasty. Okay, so that happened centuries before that, and by the 1800s, just like all previous dynasties, they're starting to decline. And as a result, you see political turmoil, or actually, it's more accurate to say political turmoil is causing their decline. Okay, so what you have here is political instability, wars happening, rebellions. You may have heard of the famous Taiping rebellion. And when I say rebellion, it's not just a small revolt, okay? This actually involves millions of people dying, okay? So, again, the Qing dynasty is experiencing instability and collapse, and you see wars erupt all over the place, political turmoil, and interestingly enough, the Qing dynasty would be the last dynasty in Chinese history, because it'll officially collapse in the early 1900s, and after that, there's no longer any dynasties, right? It's going to be actually they're going to move out of this feudal era and into the modern era, and you will see Mao as the leader after the Civil War and establish the People's Republic of China. Okay, which is still existing today, as you know. Okay, so this was a primary push factor. Okay, why? Because political instability is going to cause Chinese to move out and to avoid all that turmoil. And you add to that various factors that relate to let's just call them natural disasters, floods, and famine happening at the same time as political turmoil. Okay, and this is causing economic hardship, economic destitution, and immiseration for many Chinese. Okay, so another thing that's happening is overpopulation. So when you think about overpopulation, when the population is growing exorbitantly, but you don't have enough resources like food and so forth to feed the public, well, this is going to lead to people being squeezed out, right? Because there's not enough food, and that's juxtaposed against the growing population. Okay, so all these push factors, again, are leading to out-migration, what academics and historians call out-migration. And again, this is movement out of China to other places. But as noted here on this illustration, this area in red is going to be very important. This area in red is called the Guangdong province here. All right. And when it came to out-migration towards the U.S. West by the mid-1800s, 99% of them are going to originate from this area. Now, we know that China is very big. It's huge, right? But you won't see migrants coming from other areas around China. Rather, they'll be exclusively originating from this area, the Guangdong province. In the next slide, we'll discuss why this was the case.